talking about self-sufficiency, I don't know if you know, but about 3 years ago, there was something on LinkedIn in one of the groups which says, what is the most dangerous phrase you've ever heard in emergency management? You know, it's okay, I have a plan, or we've done this before. And the clear winner was, or the most dangerous phrase in emergency management is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. And if you hear those words, you're probably in deep, deep trouble. So let's talk about community resilience, because it seems to me that we are, if we look over the next 5 years, we are in a crisis-rich environment. We're moving into a crisis-rich environment, whether it's adverse weather, natural disasters, whether it's infrastructure failure, satellite failure, whatever it might be, hyper pollution, lack of water, lack of resources. And the idea that there's going to be some wonderful authority that's going to go and make it all better, I think is it's an old generation response. So David, I know that you've done a lot of work around social capital and community responses. What are your thoughts about the emerging trends? And is it going to be a matter, because often when the government talks about, we're going to sort of empower you and take away the government authority, all they do is they take away the funding and the support, but they don't actually give very much back. So do you see this as a structured approach to increasing social capital empowerment, or do you see it as just, governmental forces withdrawing and leaving a vacuum there? David, I've lost you. David, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, found it. Sorry. If okay. I might just share something, I forgot to unmute there. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking that specific vulnerability is part of general vulnerability. I'll have to explain by using a fried egg. Get that. There it is. We've spent a lot of time looking at the immediate causes of disaster and realizing that we had to look deeper for the root causes, and that the main causes were related to vulnerability, and what triggered all of that were the dynamic pressures that act upon all of this. Fair enough, I couldn't agree more. But I do believe that you have to look at the egg white as well, namely general vulnerability, because it's no use being resilient against something if you're not resilient against life in general. So to look at that in a slightly different way, general vulnerability, which has a lot to do with what society is up against in general, encapsulates the specific vulnerability to something like COVID or to earthquakes or to anything else. We had, for example, a fire in London, the Grenfell Tower fire, 72 dead. What caused it? I would say ideology caused it, actually. It would take a long time to explain exactly why, but it had a lot to do with the ideology of the manipulation of building codes and the violations of safety that resulted from that. I just had another couple of slides. COVID is probably the mother of all cascading disasters. And we haven't got to grips yet with how the cascades work there. But if you take, for example, the effect on housing, the effect on the housing market, that is just one way in which COVID works its way through this great chain of effects. But we also know that there are escalation points in that. And one of those is where poverty interacts with COVID, which is gradually turning out to be one of the most important things about COVID in absolute terms. Escalation points can turn an effect into a cause and lead to a further chain. So how do we put all of that together? Last slide, I promise. If we want to understand disaster, not merely COVID, but disaster, I believe that we have to look at that in a cascading manner, perhaps at different geographical scales, and with respect to the various ways that we treat causality, but also, unfortunately, to complicate it further, in this duality between the specific vulnerability to COVID or earthquakes or whatever, and the general vulnerability of modern society, the people in it, the social strata within it, and so on.
Okay, because also besides the vulnerabilities, we tend to see crisis in isolation, don't we? We think we can put a barrier around and say, this is a crisis, where of course it is always a causative process, and it's always a long tail process behind that. And anybody who doesn't see that, then you're really limiting your ability to engage with it in a meaningful way. Patrick, can I ask you a question? And to do with COVID, and to do what David Alexander's just asked. COVID itself is not a bad pandemic. In terms of pandemic, COVID is only mid-level pandemic. You know, Ebola, for example, has a 50% morbidity rate. And if we had COVID with that, we'd be really in trouble. And yet, our local, national, global risk and crisis management frameworks have absolutely collapsed in the face of what is basically a pretty mid-level crisis in terms of the global thing. It shouldn't have been like this. You know, we knew it was coming. The UK 2017 National Risk Register had pandemic influenza as its #1 risk. But pandemic, emergent viruses, we've lost Patrick for some reason. Hopefully he'll come back on. Maybe he didn't like my question. But I'll come to you, Steve. You're like the backup. Now you've got to get the ball thrown to you. And Patrick is back with us.
Yes. All right.
Patrick, you're back. Lost you for a second, but good to have you back. Why were we not good enough? Why were we not good enough as a global community? When we've been tested, to come back to your point, David Alexander, about Grenfell Tower, you talk about ideology. I think it is sheer bloody incompetence. It is people trying to bypass exactly those frameworks were put in place to ensure that things go right. And when you read the reviews, and I'm sure we've all read thousands of reviews, every time you read a review, they're all the same. They're all the same. The same reasons. The classic one I use as my example is the failure of initiative, the congressional report into Hurricane Katrina. But I mean, you read the executive summary in that, and that tells you absolutely everything you need to know about crisis management. And then you can actually take that out and you can use that as the executive summary of pretty well, of Deepwater Horizon, of Fukushima, of Challenger, of Columbia, whatever you want, you can still use that. So Patrick, let me come to you. Why do we not get this better?
Can we use that or not?
You should be able to bring stuff on your screen. Yes, there you go. Yeah.
Is it working?
Yes,
you said something. Yes, you have here. I don't know where you can see that.
It's good.
Yes. Do you see? Yes.
Yeah, all good.
I don't know exactly what kind of presentation you see. Sorry.
We have it. It's on screen. It's on screen. We can see it on screen.
You have that?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the left side, you have the FEMA administrator saying we still plan for what we are capable of doing. We still train, exercise for what we can manage, but we have to fracture our traditional mindset. And for those in the academic world, I think I would do the same. We still reflect within the normal paradigm. We still teach and exercise lesson learned. We must think, teach, and exercise to fracture the traditional knowledge. The problem is that when you say that, if people are not prepared, then they are instantly paralyzed, because you're asking me strange question, give me your answers. And the question is that, I love this initiative in Colombia. Feinstein asked people experts to come and present their ignorance. And I think it's very stimulating. Something else, John Barry, in his book on the great influenza, said that scientists decided to do something else at the end of the 19th century. And he says something very interesting. They created a system that could produce people capable of thinking in a new way, capable of challenging the natural order. And I think it's very profound. And when he tried to do that, many universities say no. And he had to just to imagine doing something else in Baltimore. He had to invent. So this is the way we have to go. So I think what we have to do now, and it is not difficult, it's not easy, that to prepare people not to have the answers to avoid surprise, but prepare them to be surprised. This is a lecture by Todd Laporte in Baton Rouge some years ago. Prepare to be creative in the unknown and not just have the answers. And please do not fire creative people in your organizations, because generally when you go up the ladders in the organization, you lose these creative people because they ask too many questions. It's much better to have all the answers and to clarify every year if the answers are clicked. Prepare the expert to navigate in the ignorance. And I also say institutionalize the ability to work on questions. This is my practice of rapid reflection force, but it's very difficult because people always tell you we are here to give answers, not to ask questions. No time to waste. And as you said, prepare citizens to be creative in the unknown situation. And this is this array of pathways to combine, and they ask you to be very bold and to dare to do things outside the normal system you are in. If you are too much afraid, you can't go on. You are stuck in your problem. And this is why during the COVID, you just ignore what is going on in China, then in Italy. Then you say, oh, WHO say it's okay, so no problem. And you lose every single battle, the one after the other. And no anticipation, very light questioning. But we need that. The problem is very far from our culture. We love to have all the answers, but this is something else, and we have to work on that. If we don't do that, is what I love is barriers in the mind, fiasco on the ground. It's sure, and our problem is that how do you invent over the edge of the world? And you have to train. And when I train people, I train them on the blank page, and not to find the answers you have in your prepared scenarios. And this is very important. I will work with you on questions we don't have in mind, and we will work on that to be creative together in this situation, and very far from that.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I mean, you know, this idea, this conceptualization, I think we're having we're moving in two directions here. One is the conceptualization of the unknowable and unknown, for which we do not have language and metaphor, and the other is how do we get personal protective equipment to frontline medical staff when we need to. You know, it is a very practical, you know, which has impacts on people's lives. Stephen, you've been in both worlds, because I can imagine that if you're working in the Central American government, being bold and disruptive is not really considered a particularly positive attribute of a player. So I imagine that you've had those frustrations of of having to adapt and negotiate and compromise the possible for, you know, what is achievable.
Yeah. You remind me of the, you know, don't fire people who are creative. My wife was relieved that I could retire at my 20-year mark as a commander without being court-martialed. It seemed that the more senior I got, the more tolerant I got of the foibles of my subordinates, and the more intolerant I got of the foibles of my seniors. And that's not a very effective trait for success in a hierarchical organization, where all the answers are supposedly coming from the top. So I mean, we all struggle with this, with the hierarchy. I think to your question about the just abysmal response to the COVID emergency, and I do believe it reflects a fairly straightforward answer on one level, which is all public health is local. The actual execution of providing information, of providing basic services is localized. Certainly in the US context, we allow that infrastructure to essentially collapse by underinvestment. And so it didn't matter, even if the Center for Disease Control was, incredibly able and agile. If you don't have the infrastructure down at the local level to actually execute on providing people basic safety and care, it's just not going to work. I describe, and I have to constantly reinforce this with Americans' audiences. I describe, from my university background, it works perhaps better than the general audience sometimes, but the CDC is a reference librarian. You go there, and they can help sort through a lot of information, but they don't provide you the means to actually execute and write the term paper, okay, and to get the stuff done. They can't. They're a finite resource. The need for that investment is just something that, for a variety of reasons, in the U.S. context, is because we manage public health at the state and local level. We essentially decided that we're going to invest all our resources around national security and then put the biggest GDP towards a federal apparatus dealing with that range of risk. And we defunded dealing with other risks that are much more probable and consequential for everyday people. And even in the end of the Cold War, that trend did not change. If anything, it just continued to accelerate. So the bottom line is, when people look around them and see that the local capacity is simply not there to actually meet the crisis, you can't, for them to be disillusioned is probably a pretty straightforward outcome. So there is some basic block and tackling that we know that we need for dealing with these risks. While we analyze them at the top, nobody was willing to fall through on the execution. I'll tell you how this is going to play out very dramatically now is with the vaccine. It looks very promising, right? Just what's in the headline the last couple of weeks. There is virtually no localized capacity in the US for the last mile problem to actually get these things in people's arms and provide 2 dosages. The vaccine has to be held under extreme cold temperatures, 70 degrees Celsius. And how does this get deployed across rural America? Just in our context, never mind as we start thinking about the developing world. You can basically, again, we've overinvested in these centralized capabilities that when you have a cascading series of risks like the ones that COVID highlighted, and there isn't the local capacity that's imbalanced, then you end up in a very, very a bad place. And so, we're seeing societies are dealing with this better as where the public health system is reasonably strong, and they can muddle their way through it. But when you don't have that, you're really in trouble.
It's we've gone two ways now, haven't we? I mean, Patrick was taking us over the edge into the inconceivable and the unthinkable, and that disruptive thinking, which is necessary. And you're talking about, the delivery of services within a chaotic, unstable environment. Arjun Boyne and Porter Hart called it a dereliction of duty. It is that is part of your public service role, is to ensure the safety, security, and well-being of your people.